Karen told me to get a job. I'm her boss's boss. The crisp autumn air of the Meadowbrook Fall Festival was a welcome change from the recycled air of the corporate offices where I usually spent my weekdays. As a senior vice president at Omnicorp, my days were typically filled with board meetings, strategic planning sessions, and the general orchestration of a large and often complex organization. Weekends, therefore, were my sanctuary, a time to shed the power suits and the weight of executive decisions for the anonymity of casual wear and the simple pleasures of community events. This particular Saturday, I was enjoying a leisurely stroll through the festival, taking in the sights, sounds, and smells of local artisans and food vendors. Meadowbrook, for all its suburban predictability, had a certain charm, and these community gatherings offered a glimpse into the lives of the people who made up the town, a perspective often lost in the upper echelons of Omnicorp. Of course, even in the relaxed atmosphere of a fall festival, the familiar archetype of the HOA Karen was bound to make an appearance. And in Meadowbrook, that role was almost exclusively filled by one Karen Mitchell. Her reputation preceded her, whispered tales of meticulous lawn maintenance enforcement, vehement complaints about acceptable holiday decorations, and a general air of self-appointed authority over all things suburban. I had encountered her a few times in town. A sharp reprimand directed at a teenager skateboarding on the sidewalk, a lengthy debate with a coffee shop barista over the precise temperature of her latte, and each interaction painted a vivid picture of unwavering entitlement. My connection to Omnicorp was, unbeknownst to Karen and most of the Meadowbrook community, quite significant. I had climbed the corporate ladder steadily over the past 15 years, my dedication and strategic vision earning me a seat at the senior leadership table. While my face might not be plastered on company billboards, my decisions shaped the direction of several key departments, including the one where, as fate would have it, Karen Mitchell held a mid-level management position. I was browsing a stall selling handcrafted wooden toys when I felt a sharp tap on my shoulder. I turned to see Karen standing there, her impeccably styled blonde hair catching the sunlight, her designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and an expression of thinly veiled annoyance etched on her face. She was dressed in impeccably tailored casual wear, the kind that screamed expensive leisure. "Excuse me," she declared, her voice carrying a note of imperious impatience that seemed out of place amidst the festival's cheerful din. "Are you just going to stand there, blocking the entire walkway? Some of us have places to be and people to see." I stepped to the side, offering a polite but neutral smile. "My apologies, I didn't realize I was in the way." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly behind her sunglasses as she took me in. My casual attire, a comfortable flannel shirt and jeans, likely didn't register as someone of any consequence in her hierarchical worldview. "Honestly," she huffed, her gaze sweeping over me with a dismissive air, "the number of people just loitering around here without any purpose, it's quite disruptive." She punctuated her remark with a sigh that implied my very existence was a personal affront. I continued to browse the wooden toys, trying to ignore her palpable disapproval. However, Karen wasn't finished. "You know," she continued, her voice laced with condescension, "it's people like you who contribute to the lack of productivity in this town. Instead of just wandering around aimlessly, perhaps you should consider getting a job." The insult, delivered with such casual superiority, hung in the crisp autumn air. The sheer irony of her statement, directed at a senior vice president of a major corporation who was simply enjoying a weekend outing, was almost breathtaking. The woman who likely spent her weekdays managing a team under my ultimate authority was now lecturing me about the virtues of employment. I turned to face her fully, my polite smile still in place, though a hint of amusement flickered in my eyes. "Actually, ma'am," I said calmly, "I do have a job." A Karen scoffed, her expression conveying her utter disbelief. "Oh, really? Doing what? Judging by your attire, I'd venture to guess it's nothing particularly demanding." The condescending jab, the immediate dismissal based on my casual weekend wear, it was classic Karen. Little did she know that the man she was so readily belittling spent his weekdays making decisions that impacted the livelihoods of thousands of people, including her own. The conflict had been ignited, the stage set for a rather interesting Monday morning. Karen's skeptical expression remained firmly in place, her belief in her own superior judgment seemingly unshakable. "Oh, I'm sure," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Probably something in the service industry. Nothing wrong with honest work, of course, but hardly a contribution to the fabric of our society." She punctuated her remark with a dismissive wave of her hand, turning to continue her brisk walk through the festival. I watched her go, a wry smile playing on my lips. The level of unwarranted condescension was almost impressive. It was a stark reminder of the assumptions people often made based on superficial appearances. Little did Karen know that the unproductive individual she had just lectured was responsible for a significant portion of Omnicorp's contribution to the local economy, including the very salaries of people like her. The rest of the fall festival passed without further incident, though I did spot Karen a few more times. Each encounter marked by her characteristic air of disapproval towards anything that didn't align with her personal standards of order and decorum. She seemed particularly perturbed by a group of teenagers enthusiastically playing frisbee near a designated quiet zone and engaged in a lengthy debate with a food vendor about the authenticity of their organic offerings. Monday morning arrived, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of corporate life. I donned my usual power suit, the casual comfort of the weekend replaced by the crisp formality of executive attire. As I made my way through the Omnicorp headquarters, exchanging greetings with various employees, my encounter with Karen at the festival was a fleeting but amusing memory. My office, located on the top floor with panoramic views of Meadowbrook, was a hub of activity. My executive assistant, Sarah, had already laid out my schedule for the day, a dense agenda of meetings, project updates, and strategic planning sessions. As I reviewed the morning's agenda, a familiar name caught my eye. Karen Mitchell, scheduled for a mid-year performance review with her department head, Mark Olson. Mark was a competent and generally well-liked manager, though perhaps a little too conflict-averse at times. I made a mental note to check in with him after Karen's review, curious to get his assessment of her performance and attitude. Over the next few weeks, I had several occasions to observe Karen within the workplace, though she remained completely oblivious to my identity as one of the company's senior leaders. Omnicorp was a large organization, and while I made an effort to be visible, I wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations of every department. Karen's mid-level management role in the marketing division meant our paths rarely crossed directly. However, I did hear rumblings through the grapevine. A few colleagues in the marketing department, whom I had more direct interaction with, occasionally mentioned a certain Karen who was known for being demanding and often critical of her team members. Tales of her micromanagement style and her tendency to find fault with even minor details were becoming somewhat legendary within the division. One afternoon, I had a meeting with Mark Olson to discuss the overall performance of the marketing department. Naturally, Karen's name came up. "So, Mark," I began, trying to sound casual, "how's the team doing? Any standout performers or areas for improvement?" Mark hesitated for a moment, a slight furrow in his brow. "Overall, the department is meeting its targets, Alex, but there are some interpersonal dynamics we need to address." "Oh?" I prompted, feigning mild interest. "Anything specific?" Mark sighed. "Well, Karen Mitchell, she's a very driven individual, no doubt, but her management style can be a bit abrasive. We've had a few complaints from her direct reports about feeling micromanaged and undervalued. And honestly, I've noticed she can be less than collaborative with other departments." This aligned perfectly with the Karen Mitchell I had encountered outside of work. Her need for control and her tendency to look down on others seemed to be consistent across different environments. "Has anyone addressed this with her?" I asked. Mark nodded. "I've had a few informal conversations, trying to coach her on a more collaborative approach. But she tends to be quite resistant to feedback. She sees her way as the only right way." I made a mental note of this. While individual management styles varied, a consistently negative impact on team morale and interdepartmental collaboration was a serious concern at Omnicorp. A few days later, I was in the company cafeteria during lunch when I overheard a rather animated conversation at a nearby table. I recognized Karen's distinctively sharp voice. She was holding court with a group of her colleagues, and the subject of her monologue was, predictably, someone she deemed to be less competent. Sonore, and honestly, she was saying, her nose practically in the air. The level of incompetence in some departments is simply astounding. You wouldn't believe the ridiculous email I received from someone in IT. Clearly, some people just aren't cut out for professional roles. The casual dismissal, the sweeping judgment. It was the same Karen I had encountered at the fall festival. The irony of her criticizing the competence of others within the very company where she herself was exhibiting problematic behavior was almost comical in its obliviousness. The conflict was escalating, not through direct confrontations between Karen and me within the workplace, as she remained blissfully unaware of my position, but through the growing evidence of her consistently negative interpersonal interactions and her resistance to feedback. The stage was being set for a moment when her professional world would collide with the consequences of her personal arrogance. And I, her unwitting observer, and, as it turned out, her ultimate superior, was gathering the information that would eventually lead to a rather illuminating performance review. The mid-year performance review cycle at Omnicorp rolled around, and as senior VP, I had oversight of the process for all departments. I made it a point to review the summaries and key feedback points for each division, looking for overarching trends and any significant concerns that needed to be addressed at a higher level. When Mark Olson's summary for the marketing department landed on my desk, Karen Mitchell's name immediately jumped out. The feedback from her direct reports was even more concerning than the earlier rumblings I had heard. Multiple team members cited a consistent pattern of micromanagement, a lack of trust in their abilities, and a highly critical and often demeaning communication style. Several individuals expressed feelings of being constantly undermined and undervalued. Mark's own assessment echoed these concerns, albeit in more diplomatic corporate language. He noted Karen's strong individual drive and her ability to meet deadlines, but highlighted significant challenges in her team leadership and collaborative abilities. He specifically mentioned her resistance to feedback and her tendency to blame others for setbacks. As I read through the detailed comments, a clear picture emerged, a picture that aligned perfectly with the entitled and condescending Karen Mitchell I had encountered outside of the workplace. It seemed her interpersonal deficiencies weren't confined to casual interactions. They were actively impacting the morale and productivity of her team. The decision was clear. While I believed in giving employees opportunities for growth and improvement, the consistent and negative impact of Karen's behavior warranted direct intervention from someone at a higher level. As her boss's boss, that responsibility ultimately fell to me. I scheduled a meeting with Mark to discuss Karen's review in more detail. Mark, I began, after we had settled into the conference room, I've reviewed the marketing department's mid-year summaries, and I have some concerns about the feedback regarding Karen Mitchell. Mark nodded, a look of relief washing over his face. I was hoping to discuss this with you, Alex. I've tried to address some of these issues at my level, but she's a tough nut to crack. We delved into the specifics, Mark providing further examples of Karen's problematic behavior, including instances where her lack of collaboration had directly hindered project timelines and her critical communication had led to unnecessary conflict within the team. The thing is, Alex, Mark explained, she's very good at what she does individually. Her strategic thinking is sound, and she's a strong writer. But her people skills, they're a major liability. I understand, I said. And this isn't just about hurt feelings, Mark. It's impacting team performance and potentially the company's overall success. We can't afford to have managers who consistently undermine their teams. We discussed potential next steps, and I made the decision to have a direct conversation with Karen myself. While I would maintain my professional demeanor and not explicitly reference our encounter at the Fall Festival, I wanted to address the serious concerns raised in her performance review and make it clear that significant changes in her management style were required. I asked Mark to schedule a meeting with Karen, informing her that a senior leader would be joining her performance review discussion. I deliberately kept my name off the initial invitation, wanting to observe her initial reaction and ensure she approached the meeting with an open mind, rather than any preconceived notions based on our prior, less than professional interaction. The day of Karen's performance review arrived. Mark and I were seated in a conference room when Karen entered, her usual air of confident self-importance slightly tempered by a hint of nervousness at the presence of an unnamed senior leader. Karen, Mark began, after the initial pleasantries, thank you for coming. As you know, this is your mid-year performance review, and joining us today is Alex, my last name, from Senior Leadership, who has some additional feedback to share. Karen's eyes widened slightly as I extended my hand. A flicker of recognition, a faint shadow of our encounter at the fall festival, seemed to cross her face, though she quickly masked it with a professional smile. Mr. My last name, she said, her tone polite but with a hint of uncertainty. It's a pleasure to meet you. The pleasure is mine, Ms. Mitchell, I replied, my tone neutral and professional. Mark has shared your review with me, and I wanted to discuss some of the feedback in more detail. We proceeded with the review, Mark outlining the positive aspects of Karen's individual contributions, while also addressing the concerns raised by her team and in his own assessment regarding her management style. Karen listened intently, offering carefully worded responses and occasionally attempting to justify her approach. Then it was my turn to speak. Karen, I began, my tone firm but fair, while your individual performance in certain areas is commendable, the feedback regarding your leadership and interpersonal skills is a significant concern. We value collaboration and a supportive work environment at Omnicorp, and the consistent reports of micromanagement, critical communication, and a lack of trust within your team are simply not acceptable. Karen's initial professional composure began to waver. But I'm just trying to ensure high standards are met, she protested, her voice taking on a defensive edge. My team needs clear direction, and sometimes that requires directness. There's a difference between providing clear direction and undermining your team's confidence and autonomy, Karen, I countered. The feedback suggests a pattern of behavior that is negatively impacting morale and potentially hindering the team's overall productivity. This isn't just about being direct. It's about fostering a healthy and collaborative work environment where individuals feel valued and empowered. As I continued to outline the specific concerns raised in the feedback, I could see the color rising in Karen's face. Her initial nervousness was being replaced by a growing sense of defensiveness and perhaps a dawning realization that this review was more serious than she had anticipated. Then came the moment of truth, the point where the professional and the personal, the workplace and the fall festival collided. Karen, I said, pausing for emphasis, I believe in giving employees opportunities to improve. However, it's important to be mindful of how our interactions, both within and outside of the workplace, can reflect on our character and our ability to lead effectively. I met her gaze directly, a subtle hint of recognition in my eyes. I recall a brief interaction we had at the Meadowbrook Fall Festival a few weeks ago. Karen's eyes widened, the blood draining from her face. The memory of her condescending remarks, her dismissive attitude, and her insulting suggestion that I get a job seemed to flood back to her. The connection was undeniable. The casually dressed man she had so readily belittled was now sitting across the table from her, a senior leader in the very company where she worked, directly addressing her performance. The shock on her face was palpable. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The HOA Karen, who had so freely dispensed unsolicited and often insulting advice, was now confronted with the consequences of her own judgmental behavior, in a setting where her professional future was on the line. The air in the conference room crackled with the weight of her realization. The stunned silence in the conference room stretched, thick with Karen's dawning horror. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and visibly shaken. The confident, often imperious demeanor that usually defined her was nowhere to be seen, replaced by an expression of utter disbelief and a growing sense of dread. Mark Olson, sensing the shift in the atmosphere and the unspoken connection between Karen and me, looked from one to the other with a confused frown. Karen, is everything all right? Karen finally found her voice, her tone subdued and laced with a nervous tremor. Mr. My last name, she stammered, avoiding direct eye contact. I think I remember seeing you at the festival. I nodded calmly, maintaining a professional but firm demeanor. That's correct, Miss Mitchell, and I recall our conversation quite clearly. You offered me some career advice. The subtle jab hung in the air, a quiet reminder of her earlier condescension. Karen flushed, her discomfort palpable. Yes, well, I had no idea. she began, her voice trailing off, the full weight of her monumental blunder clearly sinking in. Ms. Mitchell, I continued, my tone unwavering. As I mentioned, we value a collaborative and respectful work environment at Omnicorp. Your interactions at the Fall Festival, while outside of the direct workplace, reflect a certain judgmental tendency that seems to be mirrored in the feedback from your team. While we all have moments where we might not be at our best, a consistent pattern of dismissive behavior towards others is a serious concern, especially for someone in a leadership position. Karen's earlier defensiveness had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate attempt to mitigate the damage. I understand, Mr. My last name. I I truly apologize if my comments at the festival were offensive. I I made a snap judgment and it was completely unprofessional of me. It won't happen again. The sudden shift in her demeanor was striking. The HOA Karen who had so readily dispensed unsolicited criticism was now pleading for understanding and offering profuse apologies. Thank you for your apology, Karen, I said, my tone still measured. However, the concerns raised in your performance review go beyond a single incident outside of work. The feedback from your team indicates a more systemic issue with your management style. We need to see significant and demonstrable improvement in your leadership approach. I outlined specific areas where Karen needed to focus, emphasizing the importance of active listening, empowering her team members, providing constructive feedback rather than constant criticism, and fostering a more collaborative and supportive work environment. I made it clear that her future at Omnicorp would depend on her ability to address these concerns effectively. The rest of the performance review proceeded with a noticeably different dynamic. Karen was attentive and contrite, promising to take the feedback seriously and to actively work on improving her management skills. The entitled arrogance that had characterized her previous interactions was completely absent, replaced by a somewhat subdued and anxious demeanor. In the weeks that followed, there was a discernible change in Karen's behavior within the workplace. Several of her direct reports commented on her increased willingness to listen and collaborate. The constant micromanagement seemed to lessen, and her communication became more positive and supportive. Mark Olson also noted a significant improvement in her interactions with other departments. I monitored the situation closely, receiving regular updates from Mark and occasionally observing Karen's interactions myself. While it was too early to declare a complete transformation, the initial signs were encouraging. It seemed the shock of realizing the consequences of her arrogance, both professionally and personally, had served as a much-needed wake-up call. Her own judgmental behavior, both inside and outside of the workplace, had directly threatened her professional standing. The ironic twist of being condescending to her own boss's boss had served as a powerful catalyst for change. The next time I saw Karen at a company event, she approached me with a hesitant smile. Mr. My last name, she said, her tone polite and respectful. I just wanted to thank you for the feedback during my review. I've been working hard to implement it. I offered a genuine smile in return. I've noticed the positive changes, Karen. Keep up the good work. We value your contributions to the company, and I believe you have the potential to be a strong and effective leader. The resolution wasn't about enacting revenge or reveling in Karen's embarrassment. It was about leveraging a moment of unexpected irony to facilitate genuine growth and positive change. The HOA Karen who had told me to get a job was now hopefully on a path to becoming a more effective and respected leader within the very company where I held a senior position. The experience served as a quiet reminder that you never truly know who you're talking to, and that a little humility and respect can go a long way, both in the workplace and in the wider community.